We are in a critical juncture of history with the looming possibility of crisis and conflict between major powers. I think it's crucial for us to be here to discuss and explore solutions. The conversation here today has never been more relevant. And we are going to have our first keynote speech by Robert Hormats. Robert Hormats is the current vice chairman of Kissinger Associates and was the Undersecretary of State for Obama administrations. He has been a senior official for 5 different American presidents. And he's on Dr. Kissinger's historical trip to China. So during the early 1970s, he played a major role in the opening up of U.S. relations with China as senior White House economic advisor to Dr. Henry Kissinger. Robert had extraordinary career in both government and the private sector. Before taking his position at Kissinger Associates, Robert spent 25 years at Goldman Sachs and became vice chairman. During his term in government, Robert greatly advanced American diplomacy with the world. Let's welcome Robert Hormats.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I want to first welcome Ambassador Lee. It's an honor to see you. I had a great relationship with your predecessor, Ambassador Huang, and look forward to the same kind of really personal as well as professional relationship with you and the great team you have at the consulate. Chairman Ge, thank you very much for organizing this. It's a great event, a great facility. I'd never been here before, so I'm quite honored to be invited. And Ambassador Fernandez, who's really a great champion of China-U.S. relations and a good friend for many, many, many years. So it's a very good group of people and a very good opportunity for interaction. I had the pleasure, as Ambassador Lee has mentioned, of going to China very early with Dr. Kissinger. And it's interesting, obviously, that the China-U.S. relationship has changed dramatically since then. At that point, there was no trade, there was no investment, there was no exchange of students, there was really no exchange of business people except for a few companies like Motorola, and even that was very small. But now you have hotels, you have virtually every American company, certainly every large American company, has interaction with China in some way, either direct investment or partnership with Chinese companies or reliance on Chinese parts or a provision of parts of American companies to China. But we also have a relationship that has deteriorated, unfortunately, over the last decade or so for a variety of reasons. And historically, there's no point in going into those, except for the fact that we need to recognize, as the ambassador has pointed out, that we cannot look at this as a zero-sum game. We cannot look at this as we win, you lose, you win, we lose, because the partnership, the historical partnership, historically has been win-win. And I think many Americans have a deficit, and that is, and I think between our two countries, there's a trust deficit that has developed over the years, but I think a number of Americans really don't have as much of an understanding of Chinese history and culture as they need to. The last time I became very good friends with former Vice President Wang Shishan, and he made a very interesting point. He said, you Americans, and he said, I have a lot of chances as Vice President to do a lot of reading, so I've read a lot about your history. Your history begins in Athens and Rome and Europe and then across the Atlantic, but anything to the east of Greek and Roman history, like Middle Eastern history or Asian history, you Americans don't get taught that in school. So you really don't understand certain fundamentals about China and other parts of Asia. And that is, we talk about technology. China was the world technology leader for centuries. Centuries, the most modern technology in various areas emerged from China. Americans forget that. Americans also forget that China has been around for a long time, and the Chinese culture runs very deep in the people and the approach that China takes, not only in the Asian region, but in the rest of the world as well. And the other idea is the notion of respect. And we can disagree, and we do disagree. That's not unusual. We disagree with Canada on certain things, and we disagree with China. But respectful disagreement is very different from hostile disagreement. There are big differences between the two. And I think we have to learn in the way we deal with China a sense of their respect for us and our respect for them. And I go back to the early lessons I learned in the early 1970s about how do we rebuild this mutual respect? How do we rebuild this sense of common interest? And I think it is doable. You know, the question here is, now what? Very good question, because we have a new president. We have a very changing world economic order, economic and geopolitical, different power structures. The way the world works today and the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now is going to be very different from the post-war World War II economic and geopolitical environment. So we have to identify where our individual countries see common interests in this changing world and how we can help shape it together. China makes a very interesting point, and China and a number of other countries, that the president, Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State under President Truman, wrote this book called President at the Creation. What was he president at the creation of? He was president of the creation, of the world economic order that has served the world quite well, I would say, for 70 or so years. The IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, then it turned to the WTO, a whole lot of things. But we're really now at the creation of a different world order. The old world order is changing. The new world order has not yet begun. But what we do in the next 5 or 10 years is going to shape what that order looks like and how our two countries work together in it. So let me go back just to a couple of thoughts from my early days in China that have always sort of rung in my mind as to how to deal with this complicated issue, because it is complicated, and if we do it right, it can benefit the prosperity and the peace of the Pacific and of the world, both, and certainly of China and the U.S. In the early days, the U.S. had no economic relationship at all with China, and there was not even an economic department in the Foreign Office. So when I came over there, there was a little puzzlement. Well, since I was Kissinger's economic advisor, well, who's my counterpart in China, since there was not an economic department in the Foreign Office? And so they decided at sort of a dinner table, mostly the Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, said, well, he was sort of trying to figure out how do we develop this economic relationship? So he goes and looks around and says to Ji Chaoju, who was then the interpreter for Mao and for Zhou Enlai, and then also for Deng, he said, well, you went to Berkeley, you took 2 courses in economics, didn't you? He said, yes. He said, you're the economic guy. You're the guy who's going to work with the U.S. because you've got that background, you know the U.S. well. And he and I became very, very good friends, which was good for me since he had very good contacts. And so we worked on a whole lot of economic issues together. That was But that was the beginning of something that I think developed with a lot of people, and that is we developed very personal, close relationships with our Chinese counterparts, relationships of trust. We didn't have cell phones in those days. We barely had any of the technology we have today. But we developed friendships and we developed trust in each other, and we interacted, I think, in a very constructive way. The other thing that was very interesting is in the beginning, we had, and the Chinese government as well, were thinking about sort of bigger issues, the Shanghai Communique and things of that sort. And at one point, I encouraged Kissinger, I did a list of small things we could do to build the trust from below, small things that the ambassador talked about. And one of them was trade, and where we started building little bit by bit trading relations and investment relations. The other that was very important that Kissinger suggested was person-to-person relationships, trips, Chinese and American students, things of that sort. Well, that was very, very limited at that point. But these small visits, including the ping pong diplomacy, I had the opportunity, they came to Cole Fieldhouse in Maryland, right outside Washington. So since I was on the National Security Council staff and worked for Kissinger, we had a chance to play against the Chinese team. Well, needless to say, that was a horrible embarrassment for the United States because the Chinese were so good and the Americans played a totally different game, and the Chinese were so gracious that they didn't beat us 100-0. There was an actual sort of fun game. But these small interactions of people to people were things that were actually discussed in the early days between Kissinger and Chairman Mao, Kissinger and Premier Zhou, and then when Nixon came as well. So people started coming to China and getting to know China and to get into a better understanding of Chinese history and culture. And I think we have to resume the number of Chinese students. I teach a course at Yale, and the number of Chinese students studying here is much lower than it was 5 years ago or so. And I think boosting the level of Americans who study in China and Chinese who study here, I think would be extremely useful. Likewise, having more Americans visit China for cultural reasons. I mean, who can beat the culture of Xi'an? I mean, when we were there the first time, we were allowed to go down into the excavated area and actually see the statues and hear the culture of Xi'an, and it was quite remarkable. And when you understand the culture and the background and the contributions China's made, it gives you a different appreciation of the history and the influence this country had, not just in Asia, but worldwide. Paper, for instance, which was a high technology item in those days. Now we just use it coming out of a printing machine, but in those days it was very, very, very big. So these small things can add up to big things, and particularly rebuild the trust relationship. And I would say that education, student exchanges, tourist exchanges, cultural exchanges, that you're doing so well here. Look at all the beautiful Chinese art here. I mean, I gave a speech about a week ago or 2 weeks ago to a Chinese group and got this beautiful Chinese art, sketching art calligraphy. It was really beautiful. So my wife and I are trying to figure out where to put it because it's quite large and quite beautiful. But these cultural things, I think, are very important. And there are more. The idea of dealing with environmental issues. We both have an interest in doing this, domestically and internationally. Second, in medicine, the brilliant minds of China and the U.S. are needed to deal with future issues, pandemic issues, any number of issues. We need to get the best and the brightest from both sides. And it turns out that, say, 20 years ago, almost all the scholarly papers on medical issues were done by individuals. Then 2 or 3 people started doing these papers. Now there are 10 or 15 people. And before the COVID broke out, almost all the really good scholarly papers on medicine and medical issues and medical therapies were between Chinese and Americans. The research institutes of China and the research institutes of the U.S. Work together in a very important way. And I think we can do this. It's not just a benefit for the two countries, it's a benefit for our people, and it's a benefit for the world, and we have to figure out how to do it and do it better. Another that goes back to this notion that Kissinger and Chairman Mao, Premier Zhou, and then after them Deng Xiaoping years later talked about was how do we increase the interaction at the local level. And this is one thing about the American culture and the Chinese culture that many people forget, and that is that we're in a way societies that are based on very dynamic localities. In China, it's provinces and cities that are very competitive and developing at a very rapid rate. The development of Chinese cities is amazing. For Americans who went in 1972, and you see the way China's developed, not just in the coastal cities, which are huge and growing, but if you go to Chengdu, if you go to the rural cities, these are bigger in many cases than New York. They're certainly bigger than most American cities by far. And when I was at Goldman Sachs, the Chinese said, well, we were doing the privatization of China Mobile, and the guys said, you can have 3 provinces. We're going to start province by province. And in this case, the first 3, and these were southern provinces. So the guys at Goldman said, yeah, we're used to doing this for whole countries. We did it for British Telecom. I said, these 3 provinces that they're going to start are bigger than the whole of the United States. So don't be so picky. These are the magnitude, the size of the population and of China's role. Even then, and that was 30 years ago, that was bigger than the United States. So I think these kinds of interactions are important. And I hope that even if Washington is going to do, and we don't know what it's going to do in terms of tariffs and other things, the mood in Washington is very, I shouldn't say hostile, but very negative on a lot of China things. But the mayors and the governors are not. People who've been to Chinese cities and Chinese cities and Chinese provinces and American cities and American states see that there's a lot of affinity between the two, and that the mayors here, the governors here want investment, and China is a great place to provide investment, and the U.S. is a great place for China, as an investor in China. So this is another area, I think, of very important interaction that can be mutually beneficial. So even if things in Washington become a little bit more sour, and they might not, it's hard to predict what's going to happen early in this administration, but there's some pretty hawkish people on China who are in the Washington sphere, shall we say. But there are also a lot of mayors and governors who have a much more positive view, and I think it was very smart when President Xi went to the United States. He went to a small town and saw America as a small town country. To a degree, it is. We saw in the elections, a lot of these small towns and small cities made a big impact on the elections. And I think for Americans who see Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing, they also should see rural China. They should see what China, the Mitterrand used to call rural France, la France profonde, the deeper France. Well, I think that Americans should see the deeper China, not just the China of the coast, but China inland. When I was at Goldman, we went to Hue in Mongolia, to Zhongur, and I'd never seen this really rural area of China before. And it opened my eyes to the fact that China is not only a big country with a lot of people, but a very diverse country with a lot of people who don't know much about the United States and are very quizzical and asking a lot of interesting questions about the United States. So I think these are the kinds of things that I think we have done well in the past and have been very successful, even if some of the bigger issues are still yet to be resolved, but need to be resolved, like how do we deal with some of the new technologies that are emerging. We need to work with them, but we also need to work with these smaller issues that are more regional, but also go back deep into the history of Chinese-American relations from a personal point of view and a professional point of view and a national point of view. So these are two great nations who've contributed greatly to the world, have grown substantially in the last, well, China for 5,000 years, the U.S. for the last 300. So it's a little different, but we can learn from each other. And certainly the world will be worse off if the two countries have fights, confrontations, arguments, and can't reach agreement. The world will be better off if we can identify 3 or 4 or 5 really important things like climate, medical collaboration, close working relationship on educational issues, and trade and investment. And it's not going to be easy. There are lots of differences. There are lots of suspicions that have grown up over the years about motivations. But in the end, what are our interests? And our interests are working together. Our interests of the world are the U.S. and China working together. And it's going to take leadership on both sides and leadership among this very distinguished group of people who understand China and the U.S. to encourage their leaders to take a constructive relationship as the goal of our collaboration with China, not who can talk the loudest in negative terms, but who can come up with the best ideas for collaborating between our two countries. And it seems to me that's a great goal when we ask, now what? That would be the what. Close collaboration, working together, understanding that we're all better off if our two countries work together. We're all worse off if we don't. And that should be something we look at in terms of these smaller issues as well as the larger issues that I've discussed. So this is a way of sort of moving that along. And we welcome you again, Mr. Ambassador. You're going to play a major role here. A lot of Americans are going to get to know China because of you and your colleagues, and I think it'll be a great experience to collaborate together. So thank you all for coming, and thank you especially for honoring us.